Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States owes $38 trillion. Japan owes $9 trillion. The entire planet owes $315 trillion, 3 times the size of the global economy. But here's the paradox that should terrify you. If everyone owes money, who exactly is owed? The answer isn't what you think. Because when you follow the chain of creditors, when you track who actually holds the debt, you discover something disturbing. The world doesn't owe money to anyone in particular. It owes money to itself. But for bankers across 3 centuries designed it that way. Deliberately, they build a system where debt can never be repaid, where governments borrow forever, where interest flows eternally upward, and where the people who design the trap profit from every payment, every crisis, every bailout. This isn't conspiracy. This is documented history. The meetings happened, the contracts exist. The mechanisms are public record. And once you see how they build it, you'll understand why $38 trillion isn't a problem to be solved. It's the system working exactly as designed. Before the late 1600s, sovereign debt was temporary. Kings borrowed from merchants, promised repayment with interest. Sometimes they paid. Often they didn't. When a monarch defaulted, creditors lost money. The king found new lenders. Debt cleared. The system reset. Then William Paterson changed everything. England was bleeding money fighting France in 1694. King William III was desperate. The treasury was empty. Traditional lenders had stopped answering. Paterson gathered wealthy London merchants and proposed something insane. Lend the crown £1.2 million. But the loan would never be repaid. Never. Instead, the government would pay interest forever. 8% annually, guaranteed by Parliament, backed by England's power to tax. As long as the kingdom collected taxes, the interest flowed. And to manage this, Paterson proposed creating the Bank of England. Parliament approved in 1694. The merchants provided their gold. The government got war funding. And for the first time in history, national debt became permanent, not a problem to solve. A feature of the system. Here's the genius. The government paid nearly £100,000 yearly. Forever. The merchants had bought an annuity from the state. If they wanted their money back, they could sell the banknotes to someone else. The debt was transferable, but never repayable. Paterson's real innovation came next. The Bank of England could issue banknotes backed by government debt. They could print paper money up to the loan's value. This transformed debt into money. The government's IOU became currency. The more the crown borrowed, the more money entered circulation. Think about this. Debt wasn't just obligation anymore. It became the foundation of money itself. Want more currency? Government borrows more. The system was designed so debt and money were the same thing. And here's what taxpayers didn't understand. Their taxes weren't funding defense or infrastructure. They were buying perpetual income for wealthy merchants. Every tax payment, a portion flowed into private hands forever within 50 years. Every European power copied the model. France, the Netherlands, Spain. By 1790, the newly independent United States adopted it. Alexander Hamilton explicitly modeled America on the Bank of England. Permanent debt, interest from taxes, bonds as currency. Paterson died broke in 1719 despite inventing this structure. But his creation outlived him. The Bank of England still operates. British debt has never been paid off, refinanced, rolled over, expanded but never eliminated. The trap was set in 1694. By the early 1800s, European governments embraced permanent borrowing. They funded wars, built infrastructure, expanded bureaucracies. But the market was chaotic. Each loan required individual negotiation. Interest rates fluctuated wildly. Nathan Rothschild industrialized it. The Rothschild family rose from Frankfurt's Jewish ghetto. By 1800, 5 brothers operated banking houses across Europe: London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, Naples. This network was unprecedented. They moved capital across borders faster than anyone. Nathan perfected the system. Instead of lending directly to governments, he bought government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market. Government got immediate funding. Rothschild collected the spread. Investors got tradable assets. But Nathan's real power was Information. The Rothschilds built Europe's fastest courier network. When Wellington defeated Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, Nathan received news in London before government channels. The family's wealth exploded not from one dramatic trade, but from years of information advantage. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. If a government needed money, they went through the Rothschilds. Because the Rothschilds controlled access to investors across 5 capitals. Here's what made this a trap. Before Rothschild, a defaulting king refused one creditor. Damage was contained, but Rothschild made sovereign debt tradable across borders. A British bond owned by a French company used as collateral by German banks sold to an Austrian fund pledged to Dutch merchants. The ownership web became impossibly complex, deliberately so. Defaulting no longer meant stiffing one lender. It meant collapsing an interconnected network spanning nations. Governments became trapped by systemic risk. To pay interest on old debts, they borrowed more. The debt trap wasn't just permanent, it was inescapable. The Rothschild fortune peaked in the mid-1800s. They were the richest family on earth, and that wealth flowed from one source: interest on sovereign debt. They didn't manufacture anything. They lent to governments and collected interest forever. By 1900, America was an economic powerhouse with a primitive financial system. Banks operated independently. The money supply was tied to gold. There was no central mechanism to manage crises. J.P. Morgan fixed that to protect his empire. In October 1907, financial panic erupted. A scheme to corner the copper market collapsed. The Knickerbocker Trust Company failed. Depositors panicked. Lines formed outside banks. The stock market lost half its value within weeks. Morgan was 70, attending a convention in Virginia when the crisis struck. He rushed back, transforming his library into a command central. For 2 weeks, he personally organized the rescue. He gathered major bankers, locked them in his library, and refused to let anyone leave until they pledged millions to stabilize failing institutions. It worked. The panic subsided, and Morgan became America's de facto central banker. One private citizen held the entire economy together, but Morgan knew he couldn't repeat it. He was aging. The crisis exposed a fundamental flaw. America's system rested on a few powerful men. What would happen in the next panic if they couldn't help? So Morgan's associates designed a permanent solution. They needed a central bank. But Americans hated central banks. Previous attempts had failed, so they disguised it. In November 1910, Senator Nelson Aldrich organized a secret meeting. Participants traveled separately to Jekyll Island, Georgia, using only first names. For 9 days, Aldrich and representatives from the largest banks drafted the blueprint for the Federal Reserve System. The meeting stayed secret because public discovery would be political poison. If Americans learned bankers were designing monetary policy, riots would follow. The plan was brilliant manipulation. The Federal Reserve wouldn't be called central bank. It would be a system, 12 regional banks, appearing decentralized, a board appointed by the president, appearing democratic, but the structure guaranteed banker control. Regional banks were privately owned by member banks. Member banks elected regional boards. And the most important power creating money and buying government bonds went to the New York Fed, controlled by Wall Street's biggest institutions, Morgan's institutions. The Federal Reserve Act passed on December 23, 1913. Most legislators didn't grasp what they had authorized. They thought they were preventing panics. They were actually constructing machinery for infinite debt. Here's why this matters. Before the Fed, government borrowing had limits. Banks only had so much capital, but the Federal Reserve could create money simply by purchasing bonds. The government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created currency. The government spends. The debt lands on the Fed's balance sheet, backed by nothing except the promise that taxpayers will service it forever. This enables infinite debt. The Fed ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds. The government never has to stop borrowing. It can roll over debt forever because the Fed will always purchase when private buyers hesitate. Morgan died in March 1913, months before his creation came alive. But his legacy is the structure making today's $38 trillion debt possible. Without the Fed, the government couldn't borrow at this scale. With the Fed as the guaranteed buyer, there's no limit. The debt trap became infinite. By the 1970s, the system functioned smoothly across developed nations. But developing countries were different. They borrowed heavily for infrastructure. Many struggled with payments. Then, Paul Volcker weaponized interest rates and made the trap global. Paul Volcker became Fed chairman in August 1979, facing a serious crisis. Inflation was over 10%. The dollar was losing its value. America's credibility was eroding. Volcker made a bold decision: crush inflation, even if it meant deliberately causing a recession. In October 1979, he raised interest rates dramatically. By June 1981, the federal funds rate hit an unprecedented 20%, the highest in American history. This was pure economic shock therapy. Credit became incredibly expensive. Unemployment soared above 10%, till recessions hit one after the other. But Volcker achieved his goal. Inflation broke. The dollar strengthened. This, however, had another massive effect. Developing nations like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina had borrowed billions during the 1970s when rates were low. Most of this debt was in U.S. dollars with floating rates. When Volcker hiked the rates, their servicing costs exploded overnight. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil, $60 billion. Argentina, $40 billion. Suddenly, just their interest payments were more than their entire export revenues. They simply couldn't pay. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could not make its payments. Default. This should have been catastrophic. Citibank, Bank of America, Chase Manhattan, they had all extended those loans. If Mexico defaulted, they'd take massive losses. If Brazil and Argentina followed, some of America's largest banks might actually fail. Volcker could have let it happen. Let the banks absorb the losses. Let the market sort itself out. But he didn't. Instead, he orchestrated bailouts through the IMF. The IMF would lend these struggling nations just enough money to continue paying interest to the American banks. These loans, called structural adjustment loans, came with brutal conditions. Governments had to slash spending, privatize state companies, open their markets to foreign investment, devalue their currencies, and eliminate food and fuel subsidies. They dismantled their economic sovereignty in exchange for money just to keep paying interest. Now, here's the critical detail. IMF loans didn't reduce the debt. They just restructured it. They made it manageable, but permanent. This was Volcker's great innovation. When debt becomes unpayable, don't forgive it, restructure it. Lend just enough to keep the interest flowing, and in return, extract political concessions. The debt trap became a mechanism of control. This exact pattern has repeated for 40 years. Greece in 2010, Argentina in 2001, and again in 2018, Sri Lanka in 2022. Every single time, it's the same structure. IMF loans to sustain interest payments, austerity imposed, sovereignty surrendered. The debt is never eliminated, just restructured, extended, and made perpetual. Volcker passed away in 2019. But his mechanism ensures the trap is now global and inescapable. Even when countries can't pay, they aren't allowed to default. They are just refinanced into permanent dependency. Now, let's see how this all fits together. Paterson's foundation. Government borrows, pays interest forever, but never repays the principal. Rothschild's layer. Make that debt tradable globally. So a default collapses an entire interconnected system. Morgan's engine. Central banks create money to buy government bonds, creating unlimited demand. And finally, Volcker's cage, when countries can't pay. Restructure through the IMF. Don't forgive. Keep the interest flowing. The result? $315 trillion in global debt. Government, corporate, household debt. None of it is ever fully repaid. All of it pays interest. And it's all interconnected, so a default anywhere threatens stability everywhere. Let's look at the mechanism right now. The U.S. carries $38 trillion in debt. Who holds it? About $20 trillion is held domestically by pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and the Federal Reserve. They buy treasury bonds as safe assets. But these bonds pay interest. about $1 trillion yearly. That interest comes from taxes. So, taxpayers send money to the government, and the government transfers it to bondholders. And who are the bondholders? Mostly institutions managing wealth for the already wealthy. It's a direct transfer from workers to capital every year, forever. The other $18 trillion, the government owes it to itself. The Social Security Trust Fund, the Medicare Trust Fund, the government borrowed from these programs and spent the money. But ultimately, taxpayers are on the hook because when Social Security needs to redeem its bonds, the government must either raise taxes or borrow even more. Now scale this globally. Japan owes $9 trillion, Europe $14 trillion. China has massive domestic debt. Every major economy runs the exact same system, and they're all interconnected. Japan holds U.S. treasuries. The U.S. holds European bonds through the IMF. Europe holds developing nation debt through the World Bank. China holds U.S. treasuries. It's a circle. Everyone owes everyone, and the interest flows upward to institutions managing the debt. Hear us why this can never end. If the U.S. paid off its $38 trillion in debt tomorrow, the money supply would collapse. Dollars are created when the government borrows. If you pay off the debt, those dollars just disappear. This would cause massive deflation, a depression, a complete collapse. The government can never pay it off. It must keep borrowing, rolling over bonds, and paying interest. It's the same globally. If every government paid off its debt, the global money supply would shrink by 2/3. There wouldn't be enough currency to conduct trade. The system would seize. Debt can't be eliminated. It's structural. It is necessary by design. Who profits? Institutions holding debt: BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, Morgan Chase. These asset managers control tens of trillions. They buy government bonds with other people's money: pension funds, retirement accounts. Insurance premiums: about $1 trillion yearly flows from U.S. taxpayers to bondholders through interest on national debt. Add interest from Japanese, European, and Chinese debt. The total annual global interest exceeds $1 trillion every year, forever. That's the largest wealth transfer in history. Continuous, structural, invisible because it's not called a tax, it's debt service. But it's the same mechanism. Workers pay taxes. Governments transfer that money to bondholders. And the bondholders are institutional investors managing wealth for the wealthy. And here's what makes it permanent. The people managing these institutions don't want the debt paid off. A treasury bond paying interest is an asset on their balance sheet. It generates reliable income. It provides collateral for additional borrowing. As long as confidence holds, as long as people believe governments will keep paying interest. Even if they never repay the principal, the system functions perfectly for them. The debt trap is complete. Escape isn't possible without collapsing the global financial system. For architects, 3 centuries, Paterson made debt permanent in 1694. Rothschild made it global in 1815. Morgan made it infinite in 1913. Volcker made it inescapable in 1982. Together, they constructed a system where governments borrow forever, pay interest eternally, and never escape. The people controlling the bonds, managing the debt, and collecting the interest, they're the ultimate beneficiaries. Not governments, not taxpayers. Financial institutions. The final truth: $38 trillion isn't a crisis for them. It's a business model. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone's balance sheet. It pays interest. It provides collateral. As long as confidence holds, the system functions exactly as designed. For men, 3 centuries, 1 system, every government, every taxpayer, every worker on earth is caught inside it. The system has shown remarkable resilience because it was designed for survival. When banks fail, central banks provide liquidity. When governments can't pay, the IMF restructures. When markets panic, rates drop and money gets printed. Every mechanism exists to prevent debt from being repaid and prevent default from clearing the system. But cracks are forming. The U.S. now pays over $1 trillion yearly just in interest, more than defense spending. That's $1 trillion transferred from taxpayers to bondholders. Annually, Japan's debt exceeds 150% of its economy. Developing nations are defaulting more frequently. The architects built a system that can't be escaped, but they didn't build one that can necessarily be sustained forever. Something will eventually give, maybe inflation, slowly eroding the debt's real value, maybe a default, cascading through institutions, maybe a new monetary system entirely. What's certain is that 38 trillion isn't an accident. It's not mismanagement. It's the system working exactly as designed. A system where debt must grow forever because money creation depends on it. Where escape is impossible because default threatens global collapse. Where interest flows eternally upward. If this changed how you see government debt, if you now understand the numbers aren't problems awaiting solutions, but features of the architecture itself, then you're seeing how power actually works. Subscribe if you want to understand how the machine was built and who operates it. Because they won't teach you this in school. They'll teach you that debt is a problem governments need to solve. But the architects knew better. Debt isn't the problem, it's the foundation. And interest is the rent we all pay to live in their system.